Did you know that the Syrian civil war isn't just about Syria? Beneath the headlines of bombings and battles lies a high-stakes game of global power, where the United States and Russia are pulling the strings in a deadly proxy war. Why is a Middle Eastern nation at the heart of this geopolitical tug-of-war, and what are the hidden moves shaping the conflict? Today, we're diving into 10 key facts that will reveal the truth behind this modern-day Cold War playing out in Syria. The roots of the Syrian civil war go back to 2011, during a time known as the Arab Spring. This was when people in many Middle Eastern countries started protesting against their governments, asking for more freedom and better living conditions. In Syria, peaceful protests began when people demanded that President Bashar al-Assad step down. They were tired of government corruption, lack of jobs, and oppression. However, instead of listening to the protesters, the government responded with violence, arresting and killing many. This led to anger and chaos, turning what started as peaceful demonstrations into a full-blown civil war. As the protests in Syria turned into a civil war, the conflict quickly became more complicated. Different groups started fighting for control of the country. On one side, there was President Bashar al-Assad and his government. On the other side, rebel groups were trying to remove him. Over time, more groups got involved, like Kurdish fighters and extremist organizations like ISIS. Each group had its own goals. To make things worse, powerful countries like the US and Russia joined the fight, supporting different sides. This turned the war into a multi-sided conflict where no one could agree, and the fighting kept getting worse. A proxy war is when powerful countries fight each other indirectly by supporting different sides in another country's conflict instead of fighting directly. In Syria, the United States and Russia turned the civil war into a proxy war. The US supported rebel groups that wanted to remove President Bashar al-Assad, while Russia backed Assad's government with weapons, money, and military help. Both countries had their own interests. The US wanted to reduce Russia's influence in the Middle East, and Russia wanted to protect its ally and keep its power in the region. Syria became the battleground for their larger political fight, even though it wasn't their war to begin with. Fact 1. Strategic importance of Syria. Syria is very important because of where it is located. It sits in the Middle East, connecting Asia, Europe, and Africa. This makes it a key spot for trade, transportation, and controlling the region. For Russia, Syria is one of its closest allies in the Middle East and home to Russia's naval base in Tartus, its only military base in the Mediterranean Sea. This base gives Russia access to important sea routes and helps it stay powerful in the region. For the United States, Syria is important for its influence in the Middle East. The U.S. wants to limit Russia's power and keep control over key areas. Syria is also close to countries like Israel and Iraq, which are important to American interests. Both nations see Syria as a critical piece in their bigger plans for power in the Middle East. Fact 2. Russia's longtime ally. Russia and Syria have been allies for a long time, dating back to the Cold War. In the 1970s, Syria became one of the Soviet Union's closest partners in the Middle East. The Soviet Union gave Syria weapons, military training, and economic support. In return, Syria allowed Russia to set up a naval base in Tartus, on Syria's coast. This base is very important for Russia because it's their only naval base outside of their own country. It gives Russian ships access to the Mediterranean Sea and helps them show their power in the region. These strong ties are why Russia continues to support Syria's government today. Fact 3. U.S. opposition to Assad. The United States has been against Bashar al-Assad because of how he treated his own people. When peaceful protests started in Syria in 2011, Assad's government used violence, killing and arresting many civilians. The U.S. said Assad was a dictator who needed to step down. To weaken Assad, the U.S. started supporting opposition groups fighting against him. These groups wanted to remove Assad and create a new government. The U.S. gave them money, weapons, and training to help them fight. The U.S. also wanted to stop Assad's allies, like Russia and Iran, from becoming more powerful in the Middle East. For America, supporting the opposition was both about helping Syrians and protecting its own interests in the region. Fact 4. The fight against ISIS. Both the U.S. and Russia claimed they were in Syria to fight ISIS, but their goals were different. The U.S. focused on defeating ISIS while also supporting rebel groups to weaken Assad's government. Russia said it was fighting ISIS, but mainly targeted rebel groups to help Assad stay in power and strengthen its influence in the region. Fact 5. Weapons and funding. The U.S. and Russia took very different approaches in supporting their sides in Syria. The U.S. gave money, weapons, and training to various rebel groups fighting against Bashar al-Assad. These groups wanted to remove Assad from power and change the government. On the other hand, Russia supported Assad by sending him weapons, military advisors, and even troops. This helped Assad's army stay strong and continue fighting against the rebels. While the U.S. backed groups trying to take down Assad, Russia kept supporting Assad to maintain his control over Syria. Fact 6. Airstrikes and bombings. The U.S. and Russia both carried out airstrikes in Syria, but for different reasons. Russia's airstrikes mostly supported Assad's government by targeting rebel groups that were fighting against him. This helped Assad maintain control over the country. The U.S., on the other hand, focused its airstrikes on ISIS, aiming to destroy the terrorist group. While both countries used airstrikes, Russia's were aimed at keeping Assad in power, while the U.S. wanted to weaken ISIS and support groups fighting against both ISIS and Assad. Fact 7. Proxy players. In addition to the U.S. and Russia, other countries also got involved in the Syrian conflict, making the situation even more complicated. Iran supported Assad's government with weapons, soldiers, and money because they wanted to keep their ally in power and maintain their influence in the region. Turkey, on the other hand, opposed Assad and supported certain rebel groups, hoping to weaken Assad's government. They were also concerned about Kurdish fighters in Syria, whom they viewed as a threat to their own security. Saudi Arabia also supported rebel groups, mainly to counter Iran's influence in Syria. They backed groups fighting against Assad to stop Iran from becoming stronger in the region. All of these countries had different goals, which made the war even more complex and difficult to resolve. Fact 8. The humanitarian crisis. The war in Syria has caused immense suffering for civilians. Millions have been killed, injured, or forced to flee their homes, becoming refugees in other countries. Cities have been destroyed, and everyday life has become nearly impossible for many. The conflict has created one of the worst humanitarian crises, with people struggling to find basic necessities like food, water, and medical care. Fact 9. Economic and political goals. The U.S. has been focused on limiting Russia's influence in the Middle East. By supporting opposition groups in Syria, the U.S. wanted to weaken Assad's government and reduce Russia's power in the region. The U.S. sees Russia as a competitor, and they didn't want Russia to have too much control in the Middle East, especially with their military presence in Syria. On the other hand, Russia wanted to maintain its influence and power in the region. Syria is one of Russia's few allies in the Middle East, and they wanted to keep Assad in power to protect their interests. Russia also uses Syria's naval base to have a strong military presence in the Mediterranean, which is important for their regional strategy. Fact 10. The stalemate and ongoing impact. The conflict in Syria is still ongoing and unresolved. Despite the defeat of ISIS, the war continues between Assad's government and rebel groups, with foreign powers like the U.S. and Russia backing different sides. The war has had serious global consequences, including the rise of refugees and tensions between world powers. The situation remains uncertain, and finding a solution is proving difficult, with long-lasting effects on the region and the world. This proxy war in Syria shows how global powers are willing to fight indirectly in other countries to protect their own interests. Instead of going to war directly, countries like the U.S. and Russia support different sides in Syria to gain influence in the Middle East. It also reveals how countries like Iran, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia have their own goals, making the conflict even more complicated. The war highlights how global politics is shaped by competition for power, resources, and influence, and how even local conflicts can have major international consequences. The Syrian conflict has caused massive destruction, displaced millions, and worsened tensions in the region. Globally, it has shown how superpowers can fuel conflict by supporting different sides, often ignoring the suffering of civilians. The war teaches us that peaceful solutions and diplomacy are crucial, as war leads to long-term suffering and instability. The world must focus on preventing conflicts like this and finding ways to resolve disputes without violence. What do you think? Will the U.S. and Russia ever agree on Syria? Or will this proxy war keep influencing global politics? The conflict has already shown how difficult it is for these superpowers to work together, and with their different goals in the region, it's unclear when or how it will end. This war might continue to shape how countries interact with each other on the world stage for a long time. If you found this video interesting, don't forget to hit the like button. Leave a comment below with your thoughts on the U.S. and Russia's role in Syria. I'd love to hear what you think. And if you want to stay updated on more videos like this, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload.